So here we are, floodplain agriculture. We have Larry Weber from the University of Iowa and Syndra Jensen from USDA, and I'll give each of you a chance to tell us about the work that you do and you know how it pertains to the subject. So Larry, I'll let you go first.
Great, thanks, Todd. So as Todd mentioned, I'm Larry Weber from the University of Iowa. I'm also affiliated with IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering, which is the Fluid Mechanics, Hydraulics, Hydrology, and Water Resources program at the University of Iowa. I was the director of that program for 13 years. And during that period, co-founded the Iowa Flood Center, co-founded the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, along with faculty at Iowa State and University of Northern Iowa, and also led the process of bringing the Iowa Geologic Survey from the Iowa DNR to the University of Iowa and IIHR. So within the IIHR program under my leadership, we did work from groundwater to surface water to atmospheric water, from droughts to floods, from water quantity to water quality. And that notably led to the creation of the Iowa Watershed Approach Project, which is a 5-year, $96.9 million project that focuses on urban and rural resilience to flooding and to the water quality challenges that we face in Iowa.
Okay, Sindra.
Hey, hello everybody. My name is Syndra Jensen, and I work for the USDA, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, out of the Des Moines State Office. And my focus with the agency currently is conservation easements. So we have a couple programs that we use to help landowners permanently protect their properties. And then we have some other, in disaster years, we often get money to help with floodplain easements. So I'm here today to discuss some options that landowners might have in the conservation area.
Thanks. So Larry, I'll come back to you. I guess maybe you could give us a sense of what the scope of agricultural production in floodplains is. What is, how is that affecting water quality, soil loss, flooding, all of those issues? What are we looking at? I mean, how much of the floodplain is being farmed?
Yeah, so that's a great kind of opening question, Todd. And of course, I could probably chat for an hour just on this question. But in Iowa, to kind of put some rough numbers out there, we farm about 25 million acres of row crop land in Iowa. And, we often think about the 100-year and the 500-year floodplains as the delineation of our floodplains as it relates to the, National Flood Insurance Program. But to give you an idea, we farm 276,000 acres in the 2-year floodplain. So that's, land that, we could expect to flood about every other year. And, oftentimes we have these conversations about the 100-year flood happens more than once every 100 years. Well, the 2-year flood commonly happens more than about every 2 years. So that 276,000 acres that's flooding about every other year has a disproportionate negative impact on our water quality because it's those lands that are highly saturated, in fact, sometimes flooded, that in the spring, that then lead, to not only the fertilizers, commercial nitrogen and livestock-based nitrogen, livestock manure-based nitrogen flowing to our rivers and streams, but also the herbicides and the pesticides and everything else that goes into, the productive growing of corn and soybeans. So that land has a very strong and negative impact on our water quality.
So I guess I'll turn to Sindra. Your job is to help farmers who want to take land like that out of production and put it into conservation easements. Why don't you tell us about those programs and then maybe touch on the funding versus what the demand is right now?
Okay, no problem. So we have the Natural Resources Conservation Service has a history of being a voluntary conservation agency helping landowners with all sorts of conservation activities. activities. We help in campground to do conservation measures to help boost water quality, terraces, waterways, contour buffer strips, filter strips, and a wide array of other practices that we can help landowners with water issues. My program specifically deals with permanent conservation. So we have what we call the Agriculture Conservation Easements Program. It was developed with the 2014 Farm Bill. Before that, it was the Wetland Reserve Program and various other easement programs. And it is, so that is our flagship program, and that stands, we have a wetland reserve easement side, and then we have an ag land easement side. So the ag land easements is a broader program that allows for agriculture to still be done on property. But for our wetlands, we have the wetland reserve, and these are lands that meet the wetland criteria. They're hydric soils, hydrophytic plants, and the hydrology is there to maintain the wetlands. And we do them in both the pothole areas, and we have a lot of riverine sites as well. And those we have a high demand for our program. We get about $12 to $15 million a year for the ASEP program, we call it, for the WRE. And last year we took in 2020, we enrolled 6 easements. They were all rather large easements. It was 1,300 acres total for all 6, which is about our normal between 13 and 1,500 acres in that program a year. And then when we get a national declaration for a flood disaster, like we did in 2019, we had one in 2008 also. And then of course, the big floods in 1993 that affected so much of Iowa, that's where the program got started. It started as the Emergency Wetland Reserve Program that year, and it grew into the programs we have now. But the emergency program that comes through the presidential declaration sometimes contains a program called floodplain easements. And through that, we can do, we can go into riverine sites, and it's a program that's in lieu of recovery. So instead of paying landowners to recover their property again after a flood event, we can come in and offer a permanent easement and take that land out of production, permanently protect it, and try to build that floodplain back. After the 2019 floods, we had, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, 361 applications statewide for the program, and with an interest of over about 45,000 acres of landowners that were interested in enrolling. At that cost, because Iowa farmland is expensive, it's some of the most expensive land in the nation, it was about $268 million worth of interest in enrolling. And we received 36 million. So we're currently working on 37 potential projects with those landowners in various parts of the state. A lot, of course, along the Missouri River area. And so 37 landowners for about 6,500 acres. But our easement program overall, statewide, for the Wetland Reserve, we have 1,600 easements, and which is the largest number in the nation for conservation easements through our easement programs. And it totals about 191,000 acres that we're protecting right now. That'll be permanent, that are permanently protected, and those easements run with the land, regardless of ownership.
Okay, so demand is outstripping funding, and you know what's been funded is positive, but compared to the the sort of acreage that Larry was talking about, it's a slow process to take that land out of production.
Right.
Yeah. Larry, you touched on the Iowa watershed management approach. Why don't you explain in a little more in depth what's going on with that and how much progress has been made?
Yeah, so that's a project that's been underway now, just starting its 5th and final year, I should say. And so we were fortunate in Iowa to receive $96.9 million for this program. About $40 million that'll focus on stormwater management in 3 urban areas in Dubuque, Coralville, and Storm Lake. and about $40 million in a rural conservation program in 8 watersheds in Iowa, from the Upper Iowa, Upper Wapsie, Middle Cedar, Clear Creek into Coralville, English River down by Kelowna, and then the North Raccoon and East and West Nishnabotnas in central and southwest Iowa. So we have 8 watersheds, $40 million to spend. And, you know, we're delighted to say that at this point, all of the money has been allocated. Like Syndra's program, we have more interest than money available. And our project is building farm ponds and wetlands, and to a lesser extent, reconnecting floodplains, but mostly farm ponds and wetlands, and some associated terraces and grade control structures to limit sedimentation of those practices once they're built. Those projects, we have about 1,000 projects under design right now. Design, early construction, finished construction, a few that are still in the planning stages, but all of the money's allocated, 1,000 practices, more interest than money available, again, is commonly the case. We had a very wet year last year. This time last fall, it was very wet and a very wet spring. So we had a hard time with construction last year. We have much better conditions for construction this year and next year. So we're delighted by the project. It'll be over. And then, you know, we'll be hoping or looking for another, you know, similar project. We had a 5-year program before this 5-year program. So we've been at this for about 10 years. We work with watershed management authorities. They have a full-time watershed coordinator that works with voluntary landowners to enroll them. We get them built. And then our team does very detailed, you know, quantification of the benefits using mathematical models and sensors. We can make estimates of the stream flow reduction during heavy rainfall of these practices and the water quality improvement from these practices. What we're learning is that although this is a fantastic success, we're challenged by the pace of agriculture and the pace of the intensification of agriculture. So in the Middle Cedar, as an example, we're going to build about $8.5 million of wetlands in the Middle Cedar in a few subwatersheds. In that same area, over a 7-year period, they've installed 8,400 miles of agricultural drainage. So we go out and celebrate the construction of these new wetlands, and agriculture is putting in 8,000 miles of tile drainage. So as we're trying to offset the impacts of agriculture, the intensification of agriculture is happening at a faster rate than the land retirement and conservation work that's going on in the land. So I don't think we're keeping up with the pace of the intensification of agriculture.
So, you know, ultimately these issues, you know, may or may not end up in the legislature depending on what happens in the election and how things play out. But so what, I mean, is there a public policy solution to that? I mean, short of, you know, there's talk of, you know, curtailing drainage tile and all of that, but what I mean, how is that dealt with? Because that seems like a big issue. You're spending money to create these projects, but, you know, then there's just more water.
Right, and so I think there's a couple elements, or in fact, there's many elements of public policy that could help in this regard. So first, you know, could we put a stoppage on the intensification of agricultural drainage? At a minimum, should, you know, the location of those drainage lines be recorded at the county level, so we know how much is going in and we know where they're located? Should we pump the brakes a little bit on the expansion of confined animal feeding operations? You know, we see hog confinements going in, and right now, one of the biggest challenges that you know, pork farmers and operators have is what to do with the manure. They need land to put the manure on. And, you know, last year, as it was so wet in the fall, and farmers talked a lot about how hard it was to get the crop out. Well, as hard as it was to get the crop out, it was even harder to get the manure pits emptied in that wet fall before the soils froze up. So they had to work very aggressively to get all those manure pits pumped out, to get that manure applied. Of course, it was applied on very wet, highly drained soils. So most of that manure then went into those soil lines and transported downstream. So there's very little of that livestock manure that was left to serve the crop the following year. That's an issue. We got to deal with that manure issue.
One of the folks watching this panel wonders, why not say that the floodplain is a no good area, or that those who plant in it are on their own, no crop insurance, none of the protections that you would have on better land.
Well, and again, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have in any of these agricultural policy issues, is they really need to be implemented at the federal level. If we do things in Iowa that make our farmers less competitive to our neighboring states, then, certainly we don't want to, there's real reasons not to do that. So this has to come out of federal policy. The challenge with water in the federal policy is that there is no one single, secretary of water for the nation. So we have a crop insurance program that incentivizes farmers to take risk. We've got a renewable fuels standard to try to grow more and more corn. And then, we have these, natural disasters that cost billions and billions of dollars to recover from. So the participants' point of, let's pull back out of the floodplains is a very valid point, but one that would take incredible political will to be able to move forward legislatively.
Yeah, well, we saw when the Obama administration tried to do the Waters of the U.S. rule, the degree of pushback they received from lots of industry groups on something that, it was portrayed as a huge change. It wasn't as big a change as its opponents wanted us to believe. But that's a good example of what happens when you try to make sort of dramatic changes in conservation programs.
That's right.
Sindra, you were going to weigh in?
Right. When we do have our, when we're working on our easements for the floodplain protection areas, that's one of the reasons we get the floodplain money, is to in lieu of recovery. So our program tries to focus on getting folks out of the floodplain voluntarily instead of mandating it by the federal government. So we go in and offer to purchase the agriculture rights. The landowner still owns the property. We just have an easement on it. And we work to do groups of projects together. So we're taking a larger chunk of the floodplain at a time instead of just picking little pieces that we can't open up the whole floodplain to and allow the rivers to have more of their floodplain back. So we do it. Our approach is voluntary participation, and it's amazing how landowners will band together and work on a project. We have very few where one person will be the keystone that won't go in, or the piece that we need. So we just keep building on these projects and expand as much as we can, a little bit at a time.
Do the farmers that you work with, do they see this in the broader scope of water quality and flood control, or are they just trying to get, something for land that is flooded too often and isn't as productive?
We get a little bit of both. Most of these have been in family farms for at least a century, and there's a lot of them that don't want to give up on it, but they also see that they're tired and of flooding, and the floodings have become more regular. The 100-year floods are happening more often, like Larry said, and they're realizing that it's better served to be a different purpose than agriculture. So it does move as people start seeing the benefit of staying out of the floodplain and farming and not spending so much money to recover it every, more often than before. Because these folks, like the ones in Fremont County that we deal with, they got hit hard in 2011 with what was supposedly a 100-year or 500-year flood, and then it happened again in 2019. So they appear to be happening more frequently. So therefore, landowners are seeing that it just the cost of recovery is too much, and they don't want to burden future generations with that.
Mm-hmm.
What was so ironic about 2019 was that early that year, there was legislation introduced into the Iowa House that would have effectively stopped the transfer of any private lands to public lands. And what made that so remarkable was that with the floods of 2019, it seems that we would want every tool in our toolbox that would allow us to help those farmers in that repetitively flooded area. And if that means converting that land to County Conservation Board land or DNR land or other public lands, just seems like it should be a good thing to do. But anytime we, convert those lands then and take row crop out of production, then there's a big supply chain of fertilizer and herbicide and pesticide and seed providers and equipment providers that see that as, less land available to apply their products.
Yeah, and the legislature did end up passing a smaller bill that kept organizations from using the revolving fund to buy private land eventually to put conservation practices on and then donate it to a public entity. That was kind of the consolation prize for the larger bill. And that's that opposition to taking land out of production and making it public land is still a big factor at the State House and in Kim Reynolds' sales tax bill, where she was going to provide money for the Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund. There were lots of limits in there that said the money couldn't be spent on new parkland or new trails and things like that. It had to be spent on existing trails. And I know, groups like the Farm Bureau are very wary of this idea of there being more public land, even in a state where are we 50th, 40 something in the amount of public land. There isn't a whole lot of it. Larry, go ahead.
And I will say, we have our easement program. We have, like I said, 1,600 easements statewide, and only a third of those are in public ownership now.
Mm-hmm.
So not all of our conservation easements do transfer over into public ownership. A lot of them do stay with private owners that do want to maintain it for their own hunting, recreational activities, and protection. And the local governments that I see that worry about being transferred to public entities, it's the tax base in their counties. Those counties are small, they have a small population, and the way that land is taxed after it goes to the public is what they worry about the most, I think. And I don't know enough about that to speak on it. I do know our easement owners still pay taxes, property taxes on their land, and that it's a county by county decision on how that land is valued after the easement's in place.
Mm-hmm. Larry, you mentioned that conservation efforts are having a hard time catching up with or keeping up with the farming intensification and the tile line expansions and things like that. The climate's also dumping more rain on us. Obviously, that's a factor too, isn't it?
It is. And the latest National Climate Assessment Report, it has a low emissions and a high emissions, scenarios. And, by 2050 and by 2100, we could see an increase in our 5% rainiest state will increase by 10% or by 20%. And what that means is when we have these 5-inch rains, that 10% increase means that'll be a 5.5-inch rain, or that 5-inch rain in a 20% increase scenario becomes a 6-inch rain. Well, that last half inch or that last inch is converted 100% into runoff, because the first 5 inches made the soil saturated, filled the soils, fully, all the pore area filled with water, and we're already producing runoff. And then it's the last half inch and the last 1 inch that are 100% runoff. And so we do modeling, we do mathematical modeling of our watersheds, and we see that this intensification of rainfall is going to lead to even larger, more destructive events. There's no question about that. And when we think about 2050, 10 years ago, maybe that seemed like a long ways away, but we're almost 2021. It's just sort of amazing how fast time passes. that scenario and those scenarios, on average, will be on us very quick, but on individual basis are on us right now. So we're seeing that today. This bomb cyclone that went across Nebraska in 2019, it dumped very little rain. It was only about 3.5 inches of rain, but it was on snow on frozen soils. So the runoff production was 100%.
Right.
And what's amazing about that storm, and some people call it the perfect storm, from our perspective in Iowa, it could have been more perfect. If that storm would have been 75 miles to the east, Pacific Junction and Hamburg and Council Bluffs and other areas in southwest Iowa probably wouldn't exist at all today. Fortunately, it was in Nebraska. It was on the flatter, Platte River and the rivers coming out of Nebraska. If that would have been on the Les Hills, coming out of the east and west Nishnabotna and the other drainages in western Iowa, then we'd be talking about an event orders of magnitude larger than what we had in 2019.
So it may be that the 32-foot flood protection we're building in Cedar Rapids might, under that scenario in the future, might not even, as epic as 2008 was, that's not necessarily the ceiling.
So because we do this modeling, and the Middle Cedar is one of our watersheds in the IWA project, we have a very detailed mathematical watershed model there. We do another test, and that's called storm transposition. So we know what all the rainfall patterns were of that 2 weeks leading up to the 2008 event, and we can simulate that and show 140,000 cubic feet per second passing through Cedar Rapids. But what if we took the last 24 hours of rain away? No rain in the last 24 hours. The Cedar River would have crested at 100,000 CFS, so 40,000 less. What if we take another storm from the same year that happened to be up in the Turkey River watershed, and we move that onto the Middle Cedar in the last 24 hours? We can get flows in Cedar Rapids that exceed 250,000 cubic feet per second. So another 110,000 on top of the storm that happened in 2008. And so whenever somebody tells me, gosh, 08 was a perfect storm, we don't have to design for that. Again, there's another more perfect storm that could lead to an even greater event.
So, yeah. Okay. Well, and you're talking about the mapping and the modeling. With regard to these rural watersheds, how much of a pinpoint can you get as to where runoff is coming from and how it behaves? Is that becoming more accurate?
Yeah, it is. And so again, this model that we have, for the Middle Cedar, we distribute, 50,000 computational elements in the Cedar River watershed. And across that watershed, on average, they're about 40 acres in size. So we can reappropriate every cubic foot or every gallon of water in Cedar Rapids to its source within a 40-acre piece. So every 40 acres in the watershed draining to Cedar Rapids, we know where it came from. We're working towards advancing that model and coupling it with an ag systems model that also includes the cropping system. So corn, soybean rotations, fertilizer application. And I would suggest within the next 2 years, we'll be able to determine where every pound of nitrogen comes from in that watershed down to a 40-acre pixel. And, and I think, that's not meant to, again, be placing blame, but it's meant to help understand, the water quality and flood challenges that, our state faces.
Because I suppose there could be folks that might get nervous that this is leading to making farms point sources like water treatment plants. And that would, among all the things that would meet political resistance, that would be one of them.
Yeah, it would. And, people ask us all the time, well, what's the impact of tile drainage on flooding? And we did a wonderful joint study with Iowa State faculty several years ago and came up with this really unsatisfying answer. And that is that it depends. It depends on the size of the watershed. It depends on the intensity of the rainfall. It depends on the antecedent soil moisture conditions. And so there are times that we can show that tile drainage reduces the peak of floods. There are times that we can show that tile drainage increases the peak of floods. On the other hand, when it comes to water quality, what we can show and what we have shown is that about 85% of the nitrogen in our stream has passed through a tile line. Okay, so it's come through a tile line. Now, so agricultural tile drainage has a very negative impact on water quality. But because, as an engineer, I would say, because it's passing through a tile line, it could also be our greatest opportunity. So if we take those tile lines and we divert them to a bioreactor or a saturated buffer or a nitrate removal wetland, we've already got this infrastructure there. We just need to treat the downstream end of that tile system. It could be our greatest opportunity for overcoming this water quality challenge.
But as Chris Jones said at our earlier panel this morning, that there aren't enough trees in Iowa to have enough wood chips for those bioreactors.
Yeah. Well, and again, what the other challenge is that when you go to cover crops and a no-till operation and improves soil health, there's an agronomic benefit to that. There is no agronomic benefit to a wood chip bioreactor. A farmer installs those, they almost need 100% cost share or 120% cost share. You need to pay them more than the practice cost to get them installed because other than an altruistic care for the natural world, there's no agronomic benefit to a wood chip bioreactor to the farmer. We really need to focus on that water quality side needs to be on application rates.
Mm-hmm. One of our listeners here makes a point that the DNR pays property taxes on private lands they come to own, and it's a big chunk of what goes into the REAP program. So that's interesting.
Thank you.
So Sindra, do you mainly respond to farmers, landowners who want the easements, or does your agency recruit or advertise or market your program? I mean, I know you've got a lot of demand beyond funding, but I mean, I just wonder how that works.
Well, actually, in listening to Larry, we use the Iowa Flood Center's data to target areas to promote our program, especially when we also have specialized programs that we work with certain partners in certain parts of the state. We have it's called the REP, Wetland Reserve Enhancement Program, and we work with that on targeted watersheds. Partners submit proposals to us and we focus in on certain areas to work. We just have one we're starting now with the DNR as a partner in the Skunk River watershed, where we'll be putting in some large wetland complexes, and the money's focused for those. But we also partner with lots of different organizations, and we use the Iowa Flood Center maps in our ranking process so that we target the highest the riverine wetlands that have the higher flood rates and frequencies, and where we can potentially remove levees and dikes to allow the rivers to flood a little more freely in those areas. Yeah, we target a lot to build on the complexes, because a single easement by itself is great, but if we can get a larger flowage of it, like on a riverine wetland situation, if we can get a lot of landowners together where we can actually restore the reach and flow of that river, then that benefits the environment and the water quality. Our rivers are so incised. I live in Southwest Iowa, and our rivers are so incised down here. There's not a lot we can do to bring the floodplain back to those rivers naturally. There's just not enough engineering that we can do to make those banks low enough again. But there are places in the state where we can. And so we try to connect those riverine sites as much as possible back to their natural hydrology sources. But in Iowa, it's a significant challenge.
We're heading into, I believe, another farm bill cycle. I don't know if you've heard whether there's a chance for your programs to be expanded in that, or how that might play out.
Yeah, we were supposed to get a large, we were supposed to get a funding expansion in the 2018 Farm Bill. We haven't quite seen that happen yet in the funding of our regular programs. But I don't know what this year's budget's going to look like. We haven't gotten our allocation funds yet. So hopefully the easement programs will continue to grow. Both the ag land easements, where we work with a partner entity to put easements on working lands and grasslands. You know, we can do that as well. We can work with land trusts here in the state to put easements on pasture ground to make sure they stay in pasture in perpetuity instead of going into row crop. So hopefully our programs continue to grow in funding, because we definitely have a demand. Our regular riverine sign up that we have for our regular programs, we'll have 150 applicants in those every year. So we have a huge depth that we can go to of landowners who are interested in getting themselves out of the floodplain for farming, because they know that there's certain soil types they're just not making an income off of that need a different route.
Okay. Larry, there's a lot of talk at the Capitol about figuring out how to do more incentives for landowners to put conservation practices in place. There was a bill a couple of years ago, the Senate File 512 that the governor signed, put some more money in, and then there's the talk about the sales tax expansion to fill the constitutional fund. Are those the right approach, or from where you're sitting, or would you like to see other policy prescriptions for the the problems that you perceive in the water quality?
Yeah, and so folks really like to focus on incentives, and that's kind of a known practice. But we will not incentivize our way out of this flood and water quality problem in Iowa without some restrictions. And by restrictions, that means regulations. We've got to pump the brakes on some of these activities. Again, the expansion of the CAFOs, the over-application of livestock manure, the over-application of commercial fertilizer, the intensification in floodplains. So we can incentivize, but we're absolutely not going to solve this problem through incentives alone. In this 20-year period, when we've been trying to reduce nutrients by 45%, the state has invested $600 million in cost share. Okay, $600 million in cost share, and we've doubled the nitrate load leaving Iowa. That's the 20-year period. So if that's not a strong enough record or strong enough indication that we're not going to be able to do it with incentives alone, then somebody'd have to make a fairly compelling argument to be how we're going to do it with incentives.
Mm-hmm. So pumping the brakes on livestock, does that, we've seen groups advocate for a moratorium on new confinements, which hasn't gotten much traction. Talk of rewriting the matrix to make it the siting matrix that counties use. It was supposed to give them some local control, but hasn't really worked out that way. Or is there a third way?
Well, I think those are certainly at the top. I think just what is our overall production expectations for Iowa? And it could be in pork, it could be in cattle, it could be in eggs, it could be in poultry, it could be in corn, and it could be in soybeans. What are expectations in terms of a country, in terms of corn and soybean and commodity production? It's a real shame, when you've got farmers over the past couple of years that are in this race, this endless race of trying to produce more and more and more because the commodity prices simply don't support their operation. So, to me, that speaks for less production, but that's the part that we don't like to talk about. Back in the 70s, when we had a 10% set aside program that was required of farmers to to participate in federal programs. 10% of the land had to be set aside in a non-productive, non-row crop production. Those are the lands that were the wettest lands, that were the steepest slopes, that had the shallowest soils on them, and the least productive lands. So they took those lands out of production. The reason we can't get anything like a 10% set aside program through now is that our policymakers are so influenced by industrialized agriculture. That's 10% less herbicide and seed and pesticide and big green and red equipment that gets sold if we take that land out of production. It's not the farmer. The farmer would benefit by increased commodity prices. You know, when we talk about this intensification, I think as we continue to intensify parts of Iowa, we should de-intensify agriculture in other parts. And if you think to this last 6 months and this pandemic that's impacted our state and our nation and our world, and people wanted to be outside, and they're shoulder to shoulder and elbow to elbow on bike paths and running paths and every water body that we've got across the state. What if we had a driftless area, you know, driftless national wildlife area in Northeast Iowa? You know, it'd take us 50 years to get it done, you know, but the pathway could start this year, could start next year. But we got to start if we want to actually accomplish something as big as a program like that.
Well, and it seems like part of the problem is that for some of us this is a big issue, but overall sometimes water quality doesn't rate the front burner treatment that other stuff does, especially in an election where it doesn't make for, you know, scary negative ads or anything like that. Accuse your opponent of being pro-flood, I guess. I'm not sure if how that works.
Well, you know, I mean, it's a really good point. And, you know, I'm involved in a lot of conservation groups and a lot of, you know, natural resources groups. And oftentimes they're thinking about logic models and how do they influence farmers and how do we get out there and influence 90,000, you know, operators. So they have field days and they promote things like the 4Rs nutrient management program. And yet we're not making any progress on water quality. Where I've been advocating is, what about the other 3.2 million people in Iowa? You know, why don't we start talking about this more, you know, with the remainder of Iowa, the recipients of all of this water and water pollution? So we've got to really start educating our, you know, populace that, you know, these are issues. These water quality issues are often unseen in our water. You know, it's not something that you may visibly see other than, you know, algal blooms. And so we've got to start educating the other people in Iowa to the importance of good, clean, safe, recreable, you know, water.
Yeah, well, and the algae, I mean, I don't think, a lot of times people just think that's bad luck. They don't know exactly how that gets in the lakes. So, yeah. Okay. So we talked about politics and government, a system that isn't always working, but your mapping is, you know, has been extraordinarily successful. It's a tool that, you know, municipalities like Cedar Rapids use now, and when flooding threatens, that they didn't have in 2008. You're mapping the Missouri River watershed at this point, aren't you? That's got to be a pretty big task.
Yeah, we are. And so, you know, I would say over the first, you know, 11 and now 12 years of the Iowa Flood Center, we've really focused on the inland rivers of Iowa. We haven't done as much on the Mississippi and Missouri, and that was intentional. You know, the federal government puts, you know, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into managing those two big rivers. And so, but with this, you know, recent round of flooding in the Mississippi and the Missouri, you know, we do see that the technology of the Flood Center could really have value. And so we're creating a new map-based forecast system for the Missouri River along Western Iowa. And the story that we heard from many, many, many landowners, many people impacted by the 2019 floods, was we knew a flood was coming. We knew it was going to be big. We moved our equipment from where it is to a new spot, and they still had corn stalks in the cabs of combines because they didn't move it far enough. It's hard to relate a river gauge reading on a river that's 2.5 miles away, and what that potential impact could be. So we're going to create a Google Maps based forecast system that will be a visual map based forecast system that will show the extent of the inundation, and within that inundated area, show the depth of the water everywhere. So we're doing that in partnership with the National Weather Service, the Corps of Engineers, the USGS, and state and local partners throughout Southwest Iowa. This is work that, quite frankly, was unimaginable 10 years ago. As the Flood Center was just getting started, the strength and partnerships that we have with our state and federal agencies is just a testament to their good work and our good work and our trust in one another. So we're really excited about that project.
And Sindra, you live in Southwest Iowa, so that's probably good news. I don't know if you're within, if you're in the danger zone or not, but.
No, but one thing that I would like, and I struggle with when we're doing our planning, is the effects of the levees on all of our flooding in Iowa. Levees can give, those of us who've been through floods they give us a false sense of security sometimes because they are man-made, and everything man-made can breach. And then once it breaches, the water's held inside it because there's no way for it to get out. And that's one thing with the flood models that we've seen, is that sometimes they do or don't take into consideration the levees. So I'm hoping, Larry, is there a way that you're factoring in all the levees and drainage ditches that are in the Missouri River floodplain over there?
Yeah, and again, Sindra, it's a good point, and it's something that makes it so much more difficult and more complicated. So as we're building that system, we've also have to be able to, as we build the technology for that system, we also need to be able to fail the system. We need to be able to fail the levees. I mean, when 53 breaches in the levee occurred last year, each one of those breaches happened at a very specific time. It was an episodic event. It flooded land. So we've got to be able to monitor and track and do that. It also then had a downstream impact. So as those levee breaches happen, that reduced the flows momentarily in the downstream areas. So in order to be able to accurately forecast a system like that, we've got to be able to include those failures. That makes it really, really complicated. And again, I think we'll do well. We'll certainly add value on top of the forecast systems that are out there, but we will be challenged, heavily challenged in getting that right.
Well, and I know, I live in the Mississippi and Missouri are such different rivers, and I always thought that was kind of a joke. A river's a river, but they are just totally, the landscape along the Missouri River is just, the subsurface is so much different than it is on the eastern side of Iowa. So it is just totally, they have to be managed in separate ways. And I think that might be where we failed in the past, is that we try to manage every river like every river's the same, and they're not. They're all individuals, just kind of like people. We're all individuals. So Missouri does not like to be managed and contained. So very, the soils are very shifting and struggles out there finding.
Very high sediment load out there. It's a very fast river. It's a high energy river. And what happens when when the river levels come up, it also changes bed forms, which is really difficult. So, folks don't probably care or understand, but there are major large sediment dunes moving continuously down the Missouri River. And there will be flows that will be kind of transformative, that river will flatten. It'll become much more efficient, but the velocities and the erosive capacity of it is very high. It's very different than the Mississippi.
I had a question from one of the viewers. Is there an equity research piece to water quality? Who is being most negatively affected by the problem?
There's more and more research just starting now on equity and water quality and equity and flooding. And, there's an equitable component, to the water quality, it's also quite prevalent with flood issues. So oftentimes in our more mature communities, a lot of the housing stock, of the first, development and settlement of the community is along the rivers, because it was a transportation corridor and there was energy from it and water from it. And now that housing stock is usually for low to moderate income housing. So we see, a disproportionate impact on low to moderate income populations of people with different, standards of care, different home conditions, elderly, disabled, no vehicle, low income, single parent families. So that's certainly the case. I think as it relates, to water quality, I'm sure that there are similar arguments that can be made. So those things are just really being explored, I would say, more recently. We do, in our Watershed Approach project, we do have a social vulnerability index that we calculate for each community down to the census block. And we intersect that with floods to show how those communities are more susceptible to flooding.
Okay. Another viewer is worried that the floodplain mapping and the conservation easements will just enable large agriculture and monopolies to sort of continue doing what they've been doing. That if you, that's the comment. Maybe if you map the floodplain, then they don't have to take measures. I guess they don't have to change what they're doing.
Yeah, I guess I can't sort of understand that comment exactly, but I certainly do believe that probably the greatest threat going forward, and we saw this back in the 80s in the last farm crisis, that we saw the number of operators shrink significantly. So as folks that couldn't survive the last farm crisis sold out to larger and larger operations. As our farm economy is so stressed, today, I think we'll see more and more small operators get out and those be assumed into, larger operations. And, there's certainly some real concerns with that.
Would larger operations be less likely to institute conservation practices, or would they have more resources to do it? I mean, that's.
Well, again, I think that's ideological. What do they choose to do? I mean, it's
Sure.
very different than what they can do. And so I think that really becomes the question. There's a lot of discussion about precision agriculture, that's going to, we're going to technology our way through this issue. And, and the focus on profitability rather than yield. And those are valid arguments to make. But we just haven't seen any indication that those are being adopted at any sort of scale that could be measurable in terms of benefit. So that may be something that comes in the future, but there's certainly no indication now. I was in a public meeting in the Middle Cedar a year ago or so, and there was a professional certified crop advisor there, and he was talking about doing field days for the 4Rs nutrient management program, and described a dozen field days that he had done and a couple hundred farmers and operators that had attended. And I asked him in front of this group, how many of those people that attended those field days are implementing the 4Rs nutrient management program? And he said 0. And he put his hand up and he did this. He said 0. I said, so why is that? Because fertilizer is the cheapest insurance against weather. So it's just not agronomically sensible to limit the amount of nitrogen that's going on the field.
So I'm scanning these other questions. Another comment, like rivers, people also think a farm is a farm is a farm. What kind of land use changes must be made or can be made to allow land to remain in production while minimizing flood risks?
Yeah, so absolutely, soil health is a huge potential benefit. So increasing soil organic content through cover crops. We should have cover crops on every acre. we should be doing minimum tillage, no tillage, strip tillage, this broad area of conservation tillage to reduce compaction and increase infiltration. It is a game changer, but it should be on every single acre. That's what we need. We need to be moving away from the floodplains and the edge of the rivers. Okay, this idea of swinging the corn planter around on the end of the field and having it hang over the bank of the creek, we just can't have that anymore. We need buffers.
Right.
Buffers, we need soil health, and we need to manage our nutrients.
Sindra, you wanted to weigh in?
No, I'm just agreeing wholeheartedly with everything that Larry says. It's a whole system approach to protecting your farm ground. Not one thing is not going to stop nutrient loss, sediment loss. So you have to build the system to control all that. And our easement program is just a small part. I mean, it's kind of a such a specified protection that not everybody's going to fit into it, but it's the general large landscape farmers that need to help with the protection of, like you said, cover crops, filter strips, stay away from those rivers and streams. So it's a larger approach.
We've got a couple minutes left. I don't know if there are any other thoughts you want to impart that I didn't ask about or we didn't get into, or some final thoughts.
Well, I guess my final thought would be, again, that I say this all the time. We don't have an urban agenda in our work. We don't have a rural agenda, but we do have a science agenda. And I think bringing science forward in this conversation is important. And I go out and speak in rural Iowa all the time, and I look out over the crowd, and I can usually do a quick assessment and say, probably 20% or 40 or 70% of you won't like me at the end of the talk. But we're going to talk about things that we need to talk about. And it may be a little uncomfortable. It may be hard to do, but we've got to be able to talk about these things if we expect in any way to make progress that needs to be made.
Sindra, any last thoughts?
I just, I wanted to, my goal was to stay in Iowa and promote conservation to private landowners. That's what I wanted to do when I was in college and working for our agency. And we try to do it voluntarily with landowners. It works, but like Larry said, to a point, there comes a time where we're going to have to get stricter on what we're doing. And landowners, there are some that really care about their land and water quality and work really hard to protect their parcel and their part of the landscape. But we really need to widen that view and get more landowners involved.
Okay. Well, the good news, I've been reading Iowa newspapers the last couple of weeks, and there are a lot of candidates running around that say they're in favor of water quality. So that's good news. We ought to have this problem licked by this time next year, no doubt. So once all those fresh faces get to Des Moines. Okay, well, so thank you so much for your time, both of you. Lots of great insights, and I think we had a good discussion. So
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Todd, and thanks to the Gazette and
The
everybody
Gazette.
that sponsored Iowa Ideas. It's always a wonderful program for all of us. Thank you.